Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. 250 of you in theory signed up. Looks like an exact 100 right now, but that's great because I'm going to speak for 5 minutes and that'll allow the others to come on in. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, most of you, I think, will be familiar enough with Chatham House's work on Russia and the Russia and Eurasia program in particular to know that we host very different types of events. Frequently, just this week, we've had a Deputy Prime Minister from Ukraine. We've had a research roundtable with quite a niche intellectual bent to it. And today's conforms to another type altogether. In part, this is a launch of a significant new piece of Chatham House research and an accompanying publication offered by Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow on the programme here. It's also a debate between what I suspect will be some contrasting points of view, but the debate element notwithstanding, this is a very practical and policy-orientated offering of what to do with regards to Russia. And I can only really think of very little of more importance for a think tank, certainly this part of this particular think tank, that we should be doing. Keir's paper, the link to which will be posted, I think, in the chat line, and you can find it on the website. And we can send you a hard copy if you like. Just let us know. But for my money, this paper is the most direct and informed, evidence-based set of precepts for preventing Russia from inflicting grievous harm beyond its borders, which it undeniably does. Now, this being both a launch and open to Chatham House members as well as for Russia and Eurasia Programme stakeholders, we're on the record today. But I don't think knowing the panelists as I do, I know them quite well, that will change pretty much one iota of what they would say if we weren't on the record. But we are. I'll just introduce them if I may, and then we'll get on with it, by which I mean debate and discussion amongst the panelists with me first of all, and then plenty of time for questions from participants in this 75-minute event. Perhaps if I do this in reverse order of speaking, that would be the most useful here. Now, Mary Dejevsky has been writing about Russia since before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and most prominently for The Guardian and for The Independent. And while it's far from her only area of interest, and I think it's fair to say that Russia has been her primary focus over these years, I think it's also fair to say that Mary's take on Russia, her starting position even, she won't mind me saying, I'm fairly sure, because we discuss it openly a lot, is perhaps quite substantially different, not to this paper, but I hope you don't mind me saying, Mary, really from a lot of mainstream Western opinion, and that's what makes this such an invigorating event, I think. So thank you, Mary. Now, the first thing to say about Ian Hill, our second speaker, is that he's joining us from Auckland in New Zealand, and that means, of course, that it's about 12 o'clock midnight right now, which makes this one of the most heroic appearances on Chatham House Zoom meetings I have really ever witnessed. I think what Ian thought, as maybe I did, is that he really had something to say about this particular topic of deterring Russia, not least because of the practical experience in a foreign ministry, New Zealand's of course, and having served as that country's ambassador to Russia, not once, but twice. Not a unique distinction probably, but certainly a very rare one. So I really hope that everyone can see the value of Ian here today. And then finally, Keir Giles, I've already mentioned with regards to this paper, but I think it's also fair to say that over a long career dealing with Russia, as we've all had, then he has really established himself, perhaps particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, not least with a publication of Moscow Rules, his book 3 years ago, but really as the go-to analyst, Russia watcher, researcher, even provocateur for governments and the media alike. And this means that his contribution to Chatham House and more importantly to the field of and study of Russia is absolutely immense. Okay, more than enough. But we do have plenty of time at least, as to say, except for the need for Ian to stay awake. So maybe I really will finish after 75 minutes in toto. But this does bring us to you and your paper, Keir. This is the starting point. So I really want to ask, I suppose, congratulations, of course, to start with. But let's say, look, we hear constant warnings that there's this inadvertent clash between Russia and a NATO country, but it could escalate uncontrollably. So I guess what I'm asking is, wouldn't the assertive stance towards Russia that you are recommending throughout this paper, despite all the evidence you've given for how they respond, wouldn't that make it more likely that actually an assertive response would in fact be more dangerous? That's the first question, if you like, and then we'll go on from there. Over to you, Keir.
Great, thanks, James, and thanks very much for the introduction. Always happy to be your go-to provocateur whenever you need me. Speaking of which, it's a great question. Just for a bit of context for anybody that hasn't had a chance to read through the whole of the report, it is a recurring theme throughout it that empirically what we found the best way of responding to Russian hostile behavior is in an assertive manner, facing it down as opposed to rolling over and accepting it. So that, I think, the point of your question, James, is that doesn't seem to match up with the fears that many people have, that if you do face up to it, you're at risk of escalation. You're at risk of spiraling uncontrollably into a conflict between the two sides that is much larger than the specific incident you're talking about. And it's fair to say that if you look at this without looking at two key components of that fear, namely, first of all, where the warnings of escalation are coming from, and second, what the roots of the conflict are, it does look scary. And it does look reasonable when you hear Russia saying we need to find ways to rein in escalation and make sure that things are under control. But you've got to look at those 2 points. First of all, where are all the warnings coming from? And they are coming primarily from Russia, from state media, from its propagandists, from its leaders, from this network, this constellation of influencers that you have around the world to push the Russian message, all of whom Russia watchers have seen over the last few years have been pushing intensively and universally this idea that we are on the brink of unrestrained conflict and the situation is extremely dangerous. That's one part, the information part. Then there's the action part as well. Why is the situation dangerous? Well, you have to trace that back to its roots, and primarily it is because of what Russia is doing in the first place. So it's not plausible that Russia is in fact concerned about escalation when it is provoking all of the incidents that it's talking about in the first place. Now, the classic cases of that, of course, are what we see in terms of interactions between Russia and the West, Russia and other countries in the air and at sea, where Russian airmen and seamen seem to have been instructed to behave as provocatively and irresponsibly as possible. But it's broader than that. When we're talking about deterrence, it's not just the military aspects that most people think of. It's actually trying to dissuade Russia or remove the incentives for Russia from doing a whole load of things that actually damage other countries. So if you put those two elements together, first of all, what the problem is, second, how Russia is spinning it, you see a consistent pattern through so many areas of Russian behavior. It's setting up a problem, destabilizing a situation, being disruptive, and then offering something that Russia wants as a solution. In this particular case, it's talking about the potential for clashes between Russia and NATO, and the solution is for NATO to go away, to allow Russia that freedom of movement, that freedom of operation, not stand up to what Russia does. And of course, that's something that, that Russia would prefer to happen. But again, you can see this across so many different areas of activity. All of the problems that we have at the moment with gas supply in Europe come from exactly the same syndrome. Russia creating a situation and then offering its preferred outcome as the solution. Cut gas supply to Europe, say, well, if you take Nord Stream 2 and approve it fast track, then of course we'll turn the taps back on. Again and again and again, and if anybody who's read the report in detail will see this as a recurring theme. It's that particular pattern of how it works. So coming back to the original question, James, no, I don't think, and I think this comes through quite strongly in the report, that assertive response to Russia and facing down that Russian pressure in all of those domains will actually make the situation worse. In fact, time and again with these case studies we have in the paper, it shows that it is the correct response for calming the situation down.
Great, thanks, Keir. And I'm sure that Mary and Ian will both have something to say about that escalation prospect. But before I do, I'm going to ask you a second question, if I may, since you're a sort of a star attraction here. No, with all due respect to Mary and Ian, it's your paper. So let me ask you a second question. Some of the case studies in the report describe incidents we're all familiar with, and from a point of view that's almost the exact opposite of what we often hear elsewhere. The confrontation between Russian and British troops in Pristina in 1999, for example, is often described as successful de-escalation. But you actually think, from a paper, that it should have been handled differently. Why is that exactly?
I think that's related to the first question. And again, it's looking at all of the different patterns of where there have been confrontations between Russia and the West, whether it's a military confrontation, which often are the simplest and least complex of these examples, or in any of these other domains. And the persistent pattern that comes through again is that de-escalation is not always the right answer. There's the example that we come up with in the paper of the The few minutes in 1999 when British troops first encountered their Russian airborne counterparts at Pristina airport in Kosovo, which could have gone one of two ways. It's always presented as a successful example of de-escalation, but that rests on the assumption that the outcome was acceptable, which it wasn't, and the alternative would have been unacceptable, which is highly questionable. Again and again and again, what we see is that de-escalation, in effect, amounts to allowing Russia to do precisely what it wants. And our good friend Oscar Jonsson from Sweden, writing about the way in which this pattern repeats itself through Russia's interactions with the West, has made the very good point that, taken to its logical conclusion, de-escalation is basically surrender. It's giving in to everything that Russia is pushing for assertively, and also validating this Russian approach at every turn. If, when Russia throws its weight around, we say, all right, you can have what you want, then that's only an encouragement for the situation to get worse and worse.
Thank you, Keir. That's great. I will come back to you, or the others will, one way or another, but I'm going to move on, if I may. Over to you, Ian. Ian, I know you've read the paper, and I think some of it resonates with you as I understand it. But I'd be very interested to know, what worked best for you in terms of responding to Moscow when you were out there. And so I know you're not essentially going to give a critique of Keir's paper as such. That's absolutely fine. But really discuss the practical question of how we work best with Russia, or deter Russia, whichever way you want to frame that. So perhaps, if you anything you'd like to say along those lines for now, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James, and thank you, Keir, for a very thought-provoking report that certainly did resonate for me, as James said, as a small state diplomat. Having dealt with Russia over many years, starting back in the early 1980s on my first posting in Moscow. I perhaps just highlight a few points, James, that I found most pertinent in the, well, one was the striking continuity of strategic outlook and intent that Keir identifies in Russian foreign policy over time. And this places, of course, Putin's reassertion of Russia's power, status and influence very much into an enduring Russian tradition. Determined to be acknowledged as a great power and indispensable partner in managing global issues. And this is linked to a longing for respect and for relevance. Secondly, I think the Kremlin sees the world through this lens of suspicion, insecurity and threats. Now, there's an historical and cultural dimension to that, of course, but that hostility to the West has merely deepened in recent years. And I think the latest version of Russia's national security strategy has just demonstrated that. I wrote a piece on that for the Lowy Institute in Australia about a month back, and that strategy sees threats everywhere and in everything. And so this insecurity and the sense of vulnerability, coupled though with a contempt, I think, for the perceived weakness of Western societies, shapes the mindset for decision-making within the elite, as well as driving the Kremlin's domestic political narrative. Keir's report, I think, usefully highlights also the realpolitik view Russia has of the world as a relentlessly competitive arena, if you will, and the importance Russia therefore places on military strength and political will as yardsticks of great power standing. This tends to produce what I see as a transactional and adversarial approach to foreign policy and a tendency to zero-sum thinking. I think there's a lot of sense too in the guiding principle that Keir suggests in the report, and we can talk about those, but I think some of them are counsels of perfection, I fear, as a diplomatic practitioner. For example, clear and consistent messaging, whether with Russia or with your allies and partners or with your domestic constituencies, is naturally desirable, but I think it's harder to achieve in practice within our open democracies, from my experience. And likewise, setting and communicating clear parameters for acceptable Russian actions is important, but again, a shared readiness amongst all partners and allies to enforce them will, I fear, be moot. Just to move on to what you suggested, James, as a diplomat from a small Western state, what I found preoccupied me in Moscow most over my 3 tours of duty there wasn't so much the question of deterring Russia, but rather more the practical challenge of figuring out how, despite all the difficulties, we could work effectively with Russia to achieve our interests, because we do need to work with it. The starting point is that Russia matters and we can't ignore it. Russia's size, its location, its resources, its resurgent military power, its UN Security Council permanent 5 status, not to mention its ambition and resolve to be a global player. All this means we have to deal with it. We have to engage with Moscow to tackle the big problems facing the world, not least climate change, weapons proliferation, and specific issues, whether it be North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan. In my own region, the Indo-Pacific, Russia is an important partner in organizations like APEC and the East Asia Summit. And notwithstanding sanctions, Russia remains a key trade and economic partner for many Western countries, not least, as Keir said, in terms of energy. So how then can we achieve a stable and functional relationship with Russia, one that enables us to tackle important issues together and effectively, but without sacrificing our own sovereignty, interests, and values? That's certainly the challenge. And it's not easy, especially with relations between Russia and the West currently at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. And frankly, it's getting harder with the crackdown on dissent intensifying in Russia, power ever more centralized, institutions emasculated, and Russia seemingly withdrawing more into itself. Dealing with Russia in these circumstances is a long game. It has to be based, I think, on a realistic assessment, accepting the pretty narrow and modest limits of what's possible at present. And yet it's not impossible to make progress. During my career, I've seen how we can work constructively with Russia on issues, even at times of heightened tensions. Dialogue is important. We should try and find common ground where we can, while standing firm where we can't. Remember, Russia itself nowadays is much more integrated into the wider world than it used to be, not least economically. So on many of the issues, Russia itself has a stake in the outcome. Take climate change, for example, where earlier complacency was widespread in Moscow. It's now given way to a growing recognition there of the long-term risks climate change poses for Russia. Closer to home, we in New Zealand have over the years cooperated pragmatically and effectively with Russia on Antarctica. We were able, for example, during my last posting in Moscow, to reach agreement with Russia in 2017 on setting up a marine protected area in the Ross Sea, designed to protect fish stocks, which was hard going, but we managed to get there. We've also been able to work with Russia cooperatively within APEC. In one area I recall in particular, it sounds rather arcane, but it was on environmental goods protection, a very important area within APEC for us to work on, so we can get trade in those items. So I don't think we should be too pessimistic, James. I think Keir's report usefully outlines some pointers to guide dealing with Russia, which dovetail with my own experience, such as knowing exactly what you want out of a negotiation with the Russians and what you're prepared to do without, coupled with understanding as best you can Russia's interests, its objectives, and motivations. Now, at one level, of course, this is just negotiations 101, but its importance can't be overestimated in the Russian context. Working closely with partners is crucial in getting Russia on board, especially when you're a small country like mine, lacking power and leverage on its own. And yet working with others to try and, as Keir puts it, nudge Russia's cost-benefit calculus to your advantage has to be carefully judged and calibrated so as not to back Russia into a corner, making it even more recalcitrant. There are other more specific challenges in the Russian operating context I found over the years. Whether you're working in diplomacy or in trade, I found you have to work really hard to overcome an innate skepticism amongst Russian counterparts, usually equipped with a zero-sum mindset, to accepting the potential for win-win outcomes. That was very hard to do, but it could be done. Another challenge, again, as much in business as diplomacy, was getting hold of the key decision makers and identifying where blockages lie. That's difficult in Russia's opaque system. And so on matters like trade access, you may have to get creative, reaching out to local importers or sectoral groups to leverage. But on other issues, we know that the power often lies in the presidential administration, but for diplomats, you can only get as far as the foreign ministry. You can't get through to the real decision makers as you can if you're posted in London or if you're posted in Washington, DC. I think another point is it's very important to treat Russia seriously and with professional respect. Convey your views clearly and directly, but then to listen and give them a fair hearing, even when you disagree. Again, this should be self-evident, but during our time on the Security Council a few years back, at a time when the Council was highly polarized, we worked very hard to keep open, effective lines of communication with Russia, and were often able to play a useful mediating role on some quite fraught issues. Keir also, I think, rightly suggests the need to be hardened to Russian negotiating tactics, and that's certainly someone who's worked in Moscow over the years would be aware of. You have to be inured to this. You have to not be thrown by bluster or intimidated by ultimatums. Beware of offering up concessions in the hope of reciprocity, because Russians will just pocket this and come after you for more. You have to stand firm where you must. And I found that ultimately Russians respect you for this. So that goes back to where Keir started the discussion. I think, in fact, they find if you stand firm, but you treat them and their views with respect, I generally found that earns you the professional respect. So summing up, I think it's important, obviously, to remain alert to and vigilant against the myriad challenges that an assertive Russia poses. But I think we have to be careful not to demonize it in ways that close off possibilities for meaningful cooperation with Moscow, because that wouldn't serve our interests either. So I'll leave it at that. This is, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. And before I turn to Mary, perhaps I could just come back at you really on the very last thing you said.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested. I was going to ask you a different question, but you just inspired me with the point about demonization. And I just wonder if you could give me some examples of where you've seen that and what you mean by demonization. Because I personally, I mean, obviously from my standpoint, a particular one, I actually don't see it particularly, but maybe I'm just missing it or whatever. But you've seen it, so that's what's one thing. And also, but I also want to know, when the Russians have committed something particularly egregious, when you on your watch, when you were out there in Moscow, how did they take it when you pushed back, whether there was a murder, an invasion, an annexation of whatever it might have been? What was the response when you had to stand that ground? You said they sort of respected that, but could you go into that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, well, on the first point about demonize, I guess it's not so much I've got instances of demonizing. It's more the fact that I think it's very easy to try and paint it all the right and unduly alarmist terms. I think because that can blind you to the possibilities and the need for dialogue and for finding a way forward, because we have to work within pretty narrow limits at the moment. But if you convince yourself that no dialogue is possible at all, then that you can't influence Russia's behaviour, then you won't, because you won't make the effort. So I guess that's what I was getting at. In terms of, I don't want to go, as I said, because I've still got some obligations I have to respect. I'm not going to go into detail of too many specific cases, but I found that often when you did have to, you either got called in on an issue, which is never a comfortable thing for an ambassador, or when you go in to deliver a démarche, you will often get histrionics but I think anyone who's dealt with Russia in the Security Council too will know that this is often done for effect, and it can be rather bruising, but I find that that generally it's done professionally, and I find that you as long as you continue to don't lose your cool and remain calm, express your views clearly, directly, listen to them, say their views will be faithfully reported back to your government. I found that relationships survive to talk another day.
Very interesting. Listen, thank you very much, Ian. Listen, I think there's Keir, I'm going to ask you just to hold back for a second. I know there were a couple of challenges there, a couple of things I want to ask you about. Not least what Ian was saying about how, maybe there's a couple of small challenges to your paper there on how it might be hard to achieve clarity and consistency amongst democracies. And just simply really about dealing effectively with Russia and being sort of quite pragmatic about it. And so I'm going to come back to you on that, but I obviously need to get to Mary right now. So you're going to have a lot to store up, Keir. Is that okay? Now, Mary, thanks again. It's great to see you here. And I've already probably over-introduced you, and it's important that I don't second guess what you're going to say, but I do know, because we've known each other for a long time, but from correspondence and chats as well, but you often think that Chatham House kind of starts off on the wrong foot as far as analysis on Russia is concerned. We get first principles wrong often, and I know you've looked at Keir's paper here especially closely, so I'd be surprised if this is any different to you. And if so, obviously, then I'm keen to know what these fundamentals are. These fundamentals, especially of disagreement, and maybe some details too, but especially these underlying precepts that I think you might, without wishing to second guess you, as I say, take issue with. So, Mary, over to you. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I have to say, I'm quite surprised to be here. But I would also actually concur with a lot of what Ian has said. So maybe in his response, Keir will actually find it easier to respond to both of us. Because I think one of my well, let me give the positives to start with, because I think that, you know, that even I can see some positives in Keir's approach, where I think that one of the positives is that it's always good to look at what actually works in any situation, but obviously dealing with Moscow, which is the question here. So I think that's a good thing. But I think it's quite difficult to judge what actually works when you're talking about deterrence, because if you don't actually know what the other party was intending, or why they were acting as they did, then it's quite difficult to judge whether you've actually succeeded in deterrence or not. I think it's good too that Keir has avoided what I would regard as some of the traps and some of the sort of what I regard as the common mistakes in talking about Russia. One of them is the extreme personalization or demonization of Putin. Keir sees Russia as Putin, as it were, as a sort of expression of Russia, rather than Putin as something special. I think it's very useful that Keir talks about the way Russia sees itself and its borderlands as part of the same thing, as of course they would. If you're looking at the world from Moscow, then you look all around the edge of your country, whereas to outsiders, they may be looking at one particular bit, whether it's the Baltic or the Black Sea or the Pacific. So I think that's a very useful thing to say. I was also pleased to see that he dismissed the idea that the idea of the all-pervasive so-called Gerasimov doctrine, as though hybrid war sort of originated as a concept with Russia. So I think that's all very good. And I think it's good too that Keir recognises that there are actually other ways of looking at Russia and relations with Russia. He says, you know, some people regard Russia as a revisionist actor motivated by neo-imperial ambitions, and then there are others who regard Russia as a defensive actor motivated by fear and insecurity. Now, it won't come as any surprise to anybody to say that I'm firmly in the second camp, as Russia as a defensive actor motivated by fear and insecurity. But one of my problems with Keir's paper is that he puts out the possibility of these two views, but then for the most part, blithely disregards the second view and persists on the premise that Russia is a revisionist actor, that Russia is an expansionist power, and that it's always aggressively inclined. And I think that this is simply wrong. And I think there is a danger in if you start with that assumption, then you draw conclusions about what motivates Russia, and those conclusions may be wrong. Now, you know, I'll readily accept that, you know, my view of Russia as weak and insecure, and with national security as its prime objective, that there are, you know, that there are other views, and Keir's view is at the moment in the ascendant. But I'm not sure that that's a very productive way of approaching Russia. It seems to be rather dogmatic. And there's a lot about just the tone of Keir's paper. I mean, Ian talked about treating Russia with respect, and there is, to my mind, there's a sort of tone that you quite often find, I find especially with British commentators and practitioners on Russia, that treats Russia rather like a toddler and say, well, you know, you've got to be very clear, and you've got to make your position very, and you've got to be very consistent, and you've got to make it quite clear where you stand and what you won't accept and where your red lines are and all the rest of it. Now, I find that a tone which is particular to the UK. You find it less, I would say, in American discussions of Russia, and certainly less in continental European discussions of Russia, whether it's Germany or France. And I think that's not a particularly productive way of going. I'm not also sure that talking about deterrence as the be all and end all, the center point of this paper, I agree with Ian that shouldn't you really be looking at how to have the most productive relationship with Russia you can have? And by concentrating on deterrence, that's not really where you arrive at. I think there's also, and James, I think you mentioned this, at least in passing, that there is a sort of gung-ho tone to this that says we should really be more assertive on the Western side. And you talked about the episode at Pristina Airport, but there was a particular quote that I actually found quite horrific. In about 2/3 of the way through, Keir talks about the West's sort of aversion to warfare and confrontation, which I have to say I think is probably preferable. But Keir says a key part of Angela Merkel's cognitive matrix was the strong desire to avoid conventional, let alone nuclear war in Europe. Well, I mean, I have to agree with Merkel here, and I suspect that probably a large amount of public opinion in Europe would also agree with Merkel here, and that the alternative is actually incredibly dangerous. I think the only other point I'd like to make is that I think that the centrality of the annexation of Crimea, which is seen as the norm of Russian assertiveness and aggressiveness, rather than an exception. And I would see 2014 as an exception, and that it needs to be placed in the context of what happened before, the relationship between Ukraine, the dispute about the trade agreement with the EU, the toppling of Yanukovych. All those things led up to that. And I see what happened in 2014 as an exception, but also an example of Russia actually panicking because of its own insecurity and concerned that it was about to lose one of the things that maybe it valued most to its national security, which was its only warm water port. So I think that the idea of 2014 as the norm rather than exception, I think is a misreading of what happened in 2014, and to project that on the whole of post-Soviet policy, I think is distorting relations with Russia. And I suppose just one general point, Keir's paper treats Russian policy and Russian attitudes today as being part of a continuum that is the same thing as the way Russia thought and behaved during the empire, after the Bolshevik Revolution, during and after the Second World War, during communism, and after the collapse of communism. It's as though none of those cataclysmic events actually changed how Russia views the world. And I think that's simply wrong. I think to see Russia as the continuation of the Soviet Union and the continuation of Soviet attitudes, that's one of the things, one of the main things that's got Western policy into the mess that it is with Russia today. So I'll stop there.
No, Mary, that was a beautiful stop. Thank you very much indeed. And well, first to say, let no one say we don't have disparate views of Russia expanded on the Russia and Eurasia program here, because that was quite different. But and I think a lot to get Keir's teeth into. I sort of want to take you up on some of these things, but I think Keir is probably champing at the bit. But even before I let you in, Keir, just to say that I think many of you have divined, or at least 5 of you divined, but obviously I'm taking questions in a minute after I've given a few right of replies here amongst the panelists. So if you can put them in on the Q&A, then I'll read those out and ask them in a few minutes' time. So Keir, a few challenges there, from more than a few challenges. Firstly from Ian, actually, as I mentioned before, and then Mary, you sort of on the style, perhaps on the dogmatism and the tone, perhaps, but also on some of the substance, particularly really at the very start on deterrence, perhaps, as a very concept. So over to you, Keir. You've got plenty to do.
Certainly, but we also want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I will be fairly brisk. Fortunately, a lot of these things can be dealt with fairly briskly. First of all, by violently agreeing with Ian on a couple of the things that he said. Yes, keeping the channels for dialogue open is critically important. And a lot of the time, people who advocate taking a firmer line with Russia are accused of wanting to isolate Russia, to cut those channels for talking to Russia. They are told that what you really want is to have no means of communicating with Russia whatsoever. And of course, that's a nonsense. What people are advocating instead is not more communication, but better communication, actually getting those messages across that Ian was talking about. And that's a critical difference. Yes, you need to keep talking, but also this temptation that we see so often to keep talking regardless of what is actually said is highly dangerous. It's the message that you have to put across that is most important. Also completely agree with Ian that demonizing Russia is a terrible mistake, but let's go a little bit into what we mean by that. Having a false picture of Russia is counterproductive here. Having a true picture of Russia, though, is really important. And one of the things that struck me when Ian was describing his experiences in Moscow and how you work with the Russian power structures and diplomatic apparatus was that it's all very familiar to us as Russia watchers. It all sounds like exactly the kind of thing that you've experienced yourself in Moscow. Coming to it fresh, though, what Ian is describing is the differences between Russia and a country with which you can have a normal, productive relationship based on some kind of understanding that you can cooperate for the common good. All of Ian's vignettes were examples of how Russia sets itself up as an adversary to cooperative relationships and makes the relationship as difficult as possible. So absolutely, we shouldn't demonize it, but at the same time, it's vital to have a clear picture of what kind of state Russia is and how it behaves with the rest of the world. And it's that lack of clear picture that has led Europe again and again to think that Russia can be worked with like a Western liberal democracy, and again to be sadly disappointed. So I think Ian and I are on the same page. Mary, obviously not quite so much. Mary, I know you were surprised to be invited in, but I hope you can see why we did. I think it's important for people to hear what Mary has to say. And it's important for us as well, because we can stress test the conclusions and the evidence in this paper by challenging them. And Mary's done a great job of doing that. I'm quite reassured by the way those things stand up to the challenge. First of all, Mary said there were positives in the paper, which is high praise indeed. But let me just briskly run through each of the points that Mary followed up there with. And I think we'll see that some of them are relevant. Some of them are talking about a different subject altogether, and others, I think, are based on the wrong facts to start with and possibly a wrong interpretation of them as well. I think we both agree that it's difficult to judge what works when you're talking about deterrence. You can tell when deterrence fails. It's much harder to tell when it's succeeded. And Mary said, you don't know what works at all. That's the reason why we chose, wherever possible, case studies where you do know what Russia wanted to do in the first place, because they said very clearly what their objective was and then was dissuaded from it. Because yes, there's a clear and obvious problem that you can't tell when you have made Russia step back from some undertaking that it wanted to embark on, unless, of course, you actually know precisely what the objective was in the first place. And we have plenty of instances of that in the paper. Mary talked about this difference between whether Russia is revisionist or defensive, whether it's aggressive and expansionist or just lashing out in terms of fear. Mary, you said that I disregard that second view. That's not quite right. What I'm disregarding is the importance of the difference between them. I'm saying both of these are possible explanations for what Russia is doing, and more importantly than that, they're not mutually exclusive. But what I'm saying is we need to set aside the reasons why this is happening when considering exactly why Russia embarks on these behaviors, and instead be guided by what is actually going on, what Russia is doing. Because the question in this paper is how to dissuade Russia from what it is doing. There's been vast amounts written on the underlying motivations for Russia, whether it does think that it is genuinely under threat or whether it's all a fiction that is put together for domestic opinion and for its own propaganda purposes overseas. What we've done in this paper is leave that to one side and instead treat the world as it is. You mentioned the issue of treating Russia with respect, and I think it's a key question. Do you mean respect in the sense that Russia uses it, or in the sense that a Western country would earn respect? Because the two are so very, very different. And as ever, everything that Russia does fails to earn it respect anywhere except at home, because that word has so very different meanings in Moscow. You mentioned treating Russia like a toddler in order to influence its behavior. I would agree that that would be a very condescending and probably counterproductive approach if it weren't for the fact that it works. If it weren't for the fact that so many of those principles of how you deal with a very small person actually work with Moscow as well. The clarity we've talked about, the boundaries, the solidarity, making sure that there aren't mixed messages. All of these things you can copy across word for word from child psychology books to how you have examples of successfully dealing with Moscow in the past. So yes, it doesn't sound good, but the point is we're dealing with real life situations here and what have been shown again and again to work in practice. And that's where these comparisons come in. You mentioned the fact that deterrence is, that the conversation shouldn't really be about deterrence, it should be about working with Moscow. That's a valid argument, I expect, but unfortunately this particular paper is about deterrence, so we have to leave that other conversation that you're asking for to somewhere else. And you mentioned the horrific quote, as you put it, about being more assertive, about Angela Merkel saying that she would prefer not to be in a war, let alone a nuclear one. I think there are any number of quotations that you could probably take out of context from this paper and make it look as though it is a warmongering piece. And I'm rather surprised that that's the only one that you take. It is a prime example, though, of how this message that dangerous escalation is inevitable and could end up in a form of nuclear war from even the smallest of incidents is so all-pervasive from Moscow, because you've said precisely that. Mary, you've talked about how the alternative is incredibly dangerous. Finally, 2014 as an exception, placing it in context, I agree, but don't just place it in the context of what was happening in the few months before and afterwards. Place it in the context of all of post-Soviet behavior, and you find that 2014 is not so much of an exception after all. This comes back to that motivations problem. You said Russia's panicking because of its own insecurity. And yes, there is a pattern in Russian military interventions sometimes that it's a stop loss. It's a response to stopping, to a situation, a security situation, which from Moscow's point of view is getting rapidly worse and might get out of hand. So Russia moves in to control it. It's the same in Ukraine. It's the same in Syria. But again, we're getting back to that issue of motivations, and that is the part that we have not dug into in this particular paper. Instead, we're looking at the ways of removing the incentives for Russia to do these things in the first place as part of that conversation of deterrence, as part of trying to reduce the number of incidents when Russia does something that does harm its neighbors. Let's certainly dig into what the incentives for Russia are to do that and understand them, but use that as part of a means of constructing a package of measures, both in action and in words, that would actually remove that incentive and make sure, as Ian quoted, that we can nudge that risk-benefit calculus back to something which achieves a more peaceful solution. And your final point, Mary, was that about Russia's policy today being a continuation, not just of Soviet times, but of Tsarist times. And you said that I was arguing how none of the cataclysmic events had changed how Russia views the world. You have absolutely summarized the message that I arrived at in the book that James referred to from 3 years ago, Moscow Rules, where we can trace so many of these patterns for how Russia's leaders respond to threats, whether it is external threats or internal threats from their own people, whether they're real or whether they're imaginary, they're exactly the same over the centuries. There is so much today in Russia's behavior that is recognizable, not just from Soviet times, but from Tsarist times before it. And you said that I think the failure to recognize those continuities is one of the basic problems that Western European countries often have in understanding the nature of Russia as a state, because so often we are dealing with state behaviors that are out of place in Europe in the 21st century, but make perfect sense if you compare them with how Russia and the Soviet Union have behaved in previous centuries. And one of the key messages that I tried to get across in the paper is understanding that different viewpoint that Moscow has of relationships between states, and particularly relationships between itself and the West, whether it's NATO, the EU, or just broadly that Euro-Atlantic consensus on how the world works. And understanding just how differently all of those international relations seem from Moscow. That, I think, is the absolutely key aspect to start to understand how Russia can be dissuaded from destructive actions. I've talked for long enough. I'll go.
Okay. Look, thanks very much indeed, Keir. That's a good right of reply. And I will say to Ian and Mary that I think if you can weave your rights of reply to Keir's responses just there into the questions that I'm going to ask, which actually are going to come from the audience now. And I'll try and merge some together, and they do come back on Mary's points and Keir's responses in particular just now. So first of all, perhaps, just asked by my colleague Sam de Bendern, Sam's querying the Crimea exception point, Mary. She says, if you look at how do you see it as an exception? If you look at it in the context of Georgia 2008, Donbass after Crimea, cyber attacks in Estonia, you mentioned the radiological chemical weapons attacks. At what point does the exception become the rule? And that, I think, was very much a question that my colleague Beza Unal asked as well as Timothy Ash. So can I get back to you? Can I ask? I'd like to ask both Mary and Ian that question, but Mary first, and then I'll come to Ian in terms of the exceptionality.
Yes, I mean, I think that the exceptionality of Ukraine is partly in Russia's relations with it and the Soviet inheritance, but also because what happened in 2014 was, as I said, it was a very particular it was a very particular set of circumstances. Now, you point to Georgia, you point to cyber attack on Estonia, and I would say that these things are all different. They're not part of a pattern. They are different, and they have to be seen in the context of the time. And to generalize and say that this is all part of Russia's aggressive behavior, I think it neglects to ask, how did the world look from Moscow when Moscow took that particular action? Specifically on Georgia, I think to lump Georgia together with Ukraine it's repeatedly, you hear people saying that Russia invaded Georgia. Russia did not invade Georgia. Russia responded to provocations, military provocations by Saakashvili in the opening week of the Olympic Games, when he knew that the world's attention would be elsewhere, and he hoped to get away with it. And that finding of culpability was actually was reinforced and established, underlined by European Union, Council of Europe report on what had happened. So I think that it's all too easy to say, oh, Russia invaded Georgia. Russia did not invade Georgia. And we need to start from, Russia has not invaded any of the Baltic states. It has left the NATO accession states have all been left alone. They have not, they've not been overrun. They've not been invaded. There have been no aggressive actions beyond the occasional cyber attack, which has been parried by the Western side. I simply don't see these as part of the same thing.
Thank you, Mary. Ian, can I ask you the same question, really? Did you, when you were in Moscow, did you see it as a pattern, or did you see them all as different?
Unsurprisingly, I come down the middle on this one again too. I think that Mary is correct in that there is a particular sui generis factor about Crimea. I think it was essentially a preemptive strike, if you will, by Russia to at a time of great uncertainty where its equities in Ukraine generally were going. It was saying, well, at least you're not getting this. You know, this was important. Sevastopol, it's our warm water port, Black Sea base. That it was. I'm sure they had long-standing plans as to how to execute it, but it was nonetheless there was almost a preemptive move as a contingency against what else might happen in in Ukraine. Having said that, I do share Kia's view that I think that what happened, Russia's approach in Ukraine, is consonant with its wider approach to its belief to its entitlement to a cordon sanitaire around the former Soviet republics, be that in Georgia, be that in the Baltic republics, having this sense of Russian exceptionalism and a sense that Russia is somehow entitled to have this, quite apart from the various views you hear about how special Ukraine is or otherwise, which I won't get into. So I do come down the middle on that one, I'm afraid.
That's great. Thank you, Ian. Right, let's change track a little bit. Yeah, I can see you want to say. I'm coming to you anyway, Kia. But so if you need to, you can weave something into your response. But I'm also going to. But if you can combine two things, hold two thoughts in your head, then I want to ask a question from Behaviour and from Madeleine Moon MP, I think, which is Madeleine's asking, just to go back to basics a little bit. Can we have a definition of deterrence here? And Behaviour is taking that on a little bit further and asking, how can we differentiate deterrence from self-restraint? In other words, how do we actually know when Russia is actually just being self-restraint when actually they are deterred, if you see what I mean? So if that's specifically for you, Keir, and then I'm going to take some more questions particularly for Ian and Mary after that. So it's back to basics.
Sure thing. Speaking of back to basics, let me just very super briefly return to those two questions that Mary raised. First of all, whether it's isolated incidents or a pattern. Yes, you can point to each of the incidents we're talking about as having their own particular stimuli and responses from Russia. But the overriding pattern of them all is of Russian aggressive behavior. Again, leaving aside the underlying reasons for them, how many isolated incidents that do the same thing do you have to have before you admit that it actually forms a pattern over decades? Similarly with Georgia, it requires a suspension of disbelief when you're talking about the events in Georgia in 2008 to say, whatever the causes of the crisis were, that Russia didn't invade Georgia, because then how do you explain the presence of Russian troops in Georgia and the fact that they still occupy 20% of the country? So it is a question that you could go into in great depth, and it has been gone into in great depth, including in that deeply flawed EU report that you referred to, the precise chronology of how the conflict started. But to say that Russia didn't invade is a nonsense, because they ended up there. And the pattern of this behavior that Mary says is all made up of isolated incidents is so consistently appalling that Mary's put it forward as a positive thing that Russia hasn't invaded somewhere, that they haven't invaded the Baltic states, as though this is something for which we ought to be grateful. I suppose it's true, because compared to Russia's behavior with its other neighbors, that is actually probably a pretty good thing. But it also backs up one of the key messages of the paper, which is that international solidarity, in whichever form it is expressed, and in this case, it's a membership of NATO, is actually an effective deterrent. If Mary's noticed that Russia hasn't invaded the Baltic states because they're members of NATO, seems like NATO membership's a pretty good thing. Now, on that second point about deterrence versus self-restraint, yes, this comes back to the core issue of how exactly these behaviors are generated within Russia, and the core issue of when you can tell that deterrence has in fact been successful. And this, I think, is another way of framing the same question that we've been tackling from the very early stages of this conversation. You can't always tell when Russia wasn't intending to do something in the first place. But here, as in all of the other case studies, I think we need to be guided by precedent, by consistency, by what we've seen before in a fairly repetitive pattern over the years, and draw conclusions from that. Because again, there are so few exceptions to these repetitive patterns. If you've managed to read the paper in detail, you'll see that the starting point for establishing principles for what might actually deter Russia are very, very consistent Russian behaviors and consistent Russian responses to particular situations that we see time and again through the years. So for me, that burden of proof is now already reversed. It's why would Russia actually step away from those very firmly established patterns of behavior and do something which is different and unexpected?
Thanks, Keir. Right, I'm sure that Mary and Ian we could all just carry on talking, but I'm going to try and move the conversation in different ways, in different directions again. Ian, my colleague James Sher has written in with a typically complex question, perhaps, and he says, in responding to Russian initiatives promoting de-escalation, should we shy away from the point that NATO's deterrence posture has always rested on an explicit and credible threat of escalation in response to aggression by a country at the local level, be it in Berlin or Baltic states, so by possessing overwhelming force? What James is asking is what deterrent would remain at all if that threat of credible action is removed? I'll ask a question to Mary in a second as well. So I suppose it's a question really about the vitality and importance of NATO at its very heart.
Yeah, well, it's possibly to ask a New Zealander that may not be the best, but it seems to me that certainly part of the importance and the credibility of NATO lies in the Article 5 guarantee it offers to particularly those smaller members. And clearly, as Keir I think identifies correctly in the report with his discussion on the enhanced partnership, the Baltics and the Poles value very, very much having not just NATO, but particularly United States forces on the ground there as a tripwire, if you will. It only takes 100 or 200, but it's a fact that what they represent. So I think for certainly in the eyes of NATO, the NATO members on the front line, the importance of the fact that there is this commitment to come to their assistance, all for one and one for all, is extremely important. I suspect deep down they probably harbour some doubts about how many of their NATO partners might come in the area of some grey zone actions, how much that might elicit a fully unified response. But
okay,
possibly something for me to
no, thank you, Ian. No, that's perfect response. And Mary, can I I guess all I'm really asking of you, Mary, is what do you think of NATO? Do you see it as an outmoded, outdated organization, or again, if that threat of deterrence is removed, if that deterrence is removed, then what? I suppose.
Well, yes, I mean, my personal view, and it's shared by a number of other Russia watchers in the West, is that it was an absolutely fatal mistake for NATO to continue in its present form after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because I think the prime reason for its existence was cancelled by the end of the Soviet Union, and that something else should have replaced it. And I think some of the evidence for that is the difficulty that NATO has actually had in finding a coherent role for itself afterwards. But I'd also like to go on from there to say that one of the things I find quite extraordinary about Keir's paper is that he talks about Russia essentially having a sort of deluded idea of a Western threat. But he never ever mentions NATO expansion as such, or the fact that the borders between Russia and what both the West and Russia would see as an adversarial bloc, i.e. NATO, that the border has come vastly closer to Russia than it was 30 years ago. And to say in that context that Russia is the expansionist power and that the West is entirely defensive and sort of mild and accommodating and not a threat to anybody, I think that's it's certainly not how the world would look from Moscow. And I'd just like to answer another thing. Keir said that essentially it didn't really matter whether Russia's action in particular circumstances were caused by a belief that it was defending itself against an actual and genuine threat, or whether what it was doing was simply an expression of its nature as what he says an unreconstructed expansionist power. I actually think it does make a difference. I think it makes a big difference what prompted Russia's action in particular circumstances. And to say, well, the effect is the same. The effect may be the same in the West or outside Russia, but in terms of understanding why Russia was doing something and how to respond to it, I think it's absolutely crucial to observe that difference.
Thanks, Mary. So, Keir, in that case, I'm going to ask you to hold two things in your head at once. One is Mary's point there about the deluded idea of a Western threat and how it looks different from Moscow and the border being so much vastly closer. But I also want to bring in Andrei Zagorodniuk's question as well, please, which I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but I suppose what I really want to ask, what Andrei is asking actually is, what do you believe can change the approach that you want to see changed of European decision makers, assuming it needs to be changed, which I think you do assume that, or you do say that. So what will it take? What will it take to change the approach of European decision makers? That's the second part question. The first part is Mary's. Thank you.
Ian mentioned in the very first part of his response to this paper that a lot of the things that I'm asking for are quite aspirational. One of them, unfortunately, is for Western European leaders to understand the problem they're facing. Because we've seen so often that they're unable to change, whether it's France, whether it's Germany, whether it's other countries that are safely remote from Russia. Time and again, we see them ignoring these consistent Russian patterns of behavior and therefore encouraging further excesses. We've already mentioned Nord Stream once, but it is a classic case that's pushing our gas bills up at the moment because Germany refuses to listen to everybody that is pointing out that that when they say that Nord Stream 2 won't be used for blackmail, that is precisely the purpose for which it is being built, if you understand Russia. It's just the surprise is that the blackmail started before the pipeline was even commissioned, as opposed to actually when it was there. I am not hopeful for Western European leaders, particularly, I think Andrew mentioned France and Germany, to change their attitudes because, unfortunately, they're constantly renewed. And every time you have a Western European government or sometimes a North American government as well coming in, they are subject to the same delusions. A mix of optimism and hubris, optimism that things are going to be better than with Russia this time than they have been ever in the past, and hubris, thinking that they're special and they're going to be able to fix the Russia problem when nobody else has been able to before, which goes along with an unwillingness to listen to the advice of people who have been dealing with it over time. So yes, we suggest in the paper a number of things that could be done to better deal with the Russian challenge if we were in an ideal situation. But again, it is an aspiration. In terms of Mary's points about how NATO should have disappeared at the end of the Cold War and NATO is very much closer to Russia and this therefore presents a threat. This is, you mentioned other Russia watchers in the West who say this, Mary. It is the ones who take Russian messages and repeat them word for word, because that is more or less verbatim what Russia would like us to think. That point about how NATO is an anachronism and no longer exists, obviously is what Russia would want, because it is NATO that actually stands against Russia getting its way with the rest of Europe. So it would prefer it to disappear. The problem with this notion that that Russia can no longer project power over so much of Eastern Europe and the borders of Russian power have now come closer to Russia is that the underlying assumption behind that, and the reason why it's presented as a problem, is the assumption that Russia has a right to actually extend its power beyond its own national borders, which is not something, again, that fits in 21st century Europe. It's only a challenge if Russia can't project the notion of its own security, because those countries surrounding Russia are treated by the West as sovereign, independent countries which can make up their own minds about their own foreign and security policy and about their futures, as opposed to it being subjected to a Russian veto. And that gets to the absolute heart of this contradiction between Russia and the West, which lies behind so many of these expressions of it, these clashes, these conflicts that we've had examples of through this conversation. It is simply a basic difference of viewpoint between whether countries should be allowed to be independent or whether being next to Russia means that they have to subject their foreign and security policy and the futures of their societies and their people to what Moscow wants.
I will ask that question of Mary in a second, but Keir, I'm just going to come back to you one second. One thing you didn't answer of Mary's, I think, forgive me if I missed it, was this idea of the perception from Moscow. Richard Ryder's brought it up as well in the Q&A, which is the failure of Western policy, a failure to analyze the impact and perception of Moscow. You know, Mary said, you know, we just can't seem to see it as Moscow sees it. So I just, can you respond to the point that we just fail to see Moscow's point of view?
Maybe absolutely. Yes, we fail again and again to see how Moscow actually views the world and what Moscow wants from the rest of the world. But that is bound up with this refusal by Western European countries in particular to recognize just how Russia wants to deal with them. Yes, it is absolutely crucial to understand what Russia wants in order to decide whether or not that is actually acceptable from the point of view, or not just of the countries around Russia, but the rest of the world. So yes, I'm firmly in favor of trying to understand precisely what motivations are driving Russian behavior. The point for this particular paper is that conversation we can park for another time in the broader strategic sense of whether Russia is this defensive, panicky power that only ever responds to what the West is doing, or whether it does actually have some volition, some agency, some plan, some idea of where it wants its future to be, and it delivers that plan by being assertive.
That's great, thank you.
Mary, so on each individual case, yes, we need to see what Russia wants and decide whether there is a way of making what Russia wants less attractive in order to deter it from taking it.
Understood. Thank you. Mary, then, so I've asked Keir to sort of, I pushed Keir on your points. I'm going to push you on one of Keir's, which is just very simply this point about the right. It does seem to me that you don't fully accept, and correct me if I'm wrong, the absolute right of these countries around Russia's borders to be fully sovereign, fully independent, have as much as absolutely anybody else. Can you just take that one on, and I'm going to come to Ian after that with a different question.
Well, I think you've got to consider overall security, and in expanding NATO up to Russia's borders, there is a trade-off because Russia feels less secure, and sees that what it and, as I said, NATO would regard as an adversary of Russia is that much closer. Now, you know, if we look at the classic cases, which are Georgia and Ukraine, which the United States thinks were given a pathway to NATO membership at the Bucharest summit, and that other members of NATO don't think they were, and they're in a sort of eternal holding pattern. But you also have to think not just of the wishes of the West. You know, there's been a lot of pressure and assumptions put on Ukraine, selling it the idea that NATO membership is desirable, whereas in fact, at least until very recently, Ukraine was split down the middle, geographically and philosophically, about whether that was a good idea. And I think that NATO as an organization has to consider when it's broaching the question of new members, whether that strengthens the alliance or whether it weakens the alliance. And I think the case is not nearly as clear cut as some would have it for saying that that including expanding through the Baltic states to former Warsaw Pact states, now looking at the Western Balkans, Does that enhance NATO countries' security, or does it jeopardize it? Nothing to do with Russia's intentions or Russia's intrinsic nature, but simply expanding to weaker countries that are themselves could be seen as a security risk and a liability to NATO. I think that equation is much more finely balanced than maybe Keir presents it as.
Okay, Mary, thank you very much. I would absolutely love to carry on this particular line of inquiry, but I must move on partly because I can see we've got about 4 minutes left. Doesn't time fly? And partly because I've seen him rubbing his eyes a few times. So Ian, perhaps for the last time, can I ask you a question put by Maxine David? How important is it, Maxine asks, how possible is it to communicate with ordinary Russians to try to counter the Kremlin's message of encirclement and threat, if you like? Focusing, therefore, too much on the short and medium term and insufficiently at the longer term in helping to shape the perspective of Russia's future leaders. That's just to you, Ian, really. Then I'll probably come to Keir for a final word, if that's okay.
I think that's it's highly desirable to do so. I think it's become increasingly difficult in the situation where the Russian government is making it much harder for organizations such as the British Council, for other organizations to function openly and to do these kinds of activities. It is becoming harder to run what we in the diplomatic trade call a public diplomacy campaign, which we can, as Keir was talking about, you can do in other perhaps ordinary countries. It's harder to do that now in Russia. It used to be done much more easily in the 1990s. So the answer is it's desirable and it has been done 15, 20 years ago, but it's getting tougher to do it. But it's highly desirable to do it because otherwise the only picture that a lot of ordinary Russians are getting, especially of the older generation who rely on television for their news and views, is of the West going to hell in a handbasket, and the subliminal messages, thank goodness you've got me, which is the man in the Kremlin. So that's it is desirable that a different viewpoint be put. Can I just say before you go back to Keir, just one?
Of course, please, please do.
One thing that strikes me as a New Zealander and coming from my part of the world is this paper, of course, it quite understandably has a very Europe kind of focus to it, and it's I think it's worth bearing in mind just that that and putting it out there that the post-Crimea estrangement, if you will, James, Russia's estrangement from the US and the EU has really given impetus to this whole closer alignment and strengthening of relations with China in particular, which is of course underpinned by political affinities, economic complementarities, policy convergences, and etc. And it's really interesting at the moment seeing how Russia is having to negotiate its diplomacy in Asia, be it with China, be it with India, and be it with others with the rise of the Quad. And I think there's a whole rich discussion we could have there. But
very interesting.
There is a whole flip side to this.
Very fair point. Mary, did I see you put your hand up there?
Yes.
Okay, is that right? Is that a hand? I'm going to give the last words to Keir if you don't mind.
Yes, no, I wanted to respond to one thing that Keir said. When I mentioned other people who rejected the continuation of NATO at the end of the Cold War, there was the classic response that bundles you if you think that as somebody who basically takes Moscow's view, who's sympathetic to Moscow's view, who's basically parroting Moscow's message. I wouldn't count people like Jack Matlock and Strobe Talbot as people in that category, and I wouldn't put myself in that category either. It's like saying, just because you question certain things, you are in the other camp. That is not true.
Okay, thank you for that. Keir can respond to those points, but Keir, I'm going to ask you the last question as well, if I may, as we're at 1 minute to the time. Keir, listen. We published this report, as you know, you were a co-author, about myths and misconceptions in April, May, and it got a very hostile reaction from Russia, as you know, and potentially you could even argue that this new report, your report, takes on an even firmer stance on dealing with Moscow. So, do you think we'll expect more critique in return? What has the reaction to the report been that you've seen so far, and how has Russia responded in particular? And this is your last chance, Keir, because we are really at 2:15 UK time. No, 1:15
UK time.
It's
surprisingly quiet. Yes, as you say, the Myths and Misconception report got a hail of criticism from Russia. This one has not got much at all, unless you count the persistent attacks of Russian hackers who hammering at the doors of my Gmail accounts. It's been really pretty unsubstantial. Where people have picked up on specific points from the paper, it's not really an argument with the substance of it. It's attempting to pick holes in some of the footnotes. So in a way, that too is fairly reassuring in terms of the robustness of the conclusions. Now, I know time is super short, but Mary, just for the record, I defend you when people say that you just repeat what Russia says. I defend you when people say that you must be consciously parroting these Russian messages. I say, no, that is not necessarily the case, because it is perfectly possible for somebody to convince themselves that they've arrived at these ideas on their own without actually getting them from Moscow. It just takes a simple mental trick, which is treating everything that Russia says as trustworthy and treating everything that the US and the UK says as inherently suspect. As soon as you go through that, you can start to build up all of the specific ways that you see the world that you express in your columns. Trouble is, as soon as you weigh the actions and words of both sides equally and apply a similar standard of evidence to both of them and judge them on not just their plausibility, but their track record, all of those conspiracy theories come tumbling down.
Not conspiracy theories.
You said
Okay.
Nothing to do with Russia's intrinsic nature that NATO has expanded. If it weren't for Russia's intrinsic NATO, there would be no reason for countries to seek membership of NATO.
Keir, thank you very much indeed. Mary, I know you're desperate to reply, but I'm sorry, we really are 2 minutes over time. It's been a fantastic, a really classical debate on Russia in so many ways, and you've all been so game. Mary, just for being here, and I'm enormously grateful to you. Ian, obviously for your perspective and for staying up till God knows what hour in Auckland, and Keir for as ever, your enthusiasm and abilities and mastery, quite frankly, over this subject. We could just do this for hours, and hopefully the members events team will let us do this again in the very near future. But for now, I'll have to bid you all goodbye from Madrid and a slightly yellow hotel room. But just to say that this has been quite honestly one of the most fulfilling events we've had for a long time, and long may these kinds of things continue. So congratulations to all. See you next time. Bye-bye.